Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and today let's talk about the most heated discussion in aviation internet. Which is better, Boeing or Airbus? I want to provide two perspectives on this. Number one, my perspective as a real-life airline pilot, and number two, my perspective as a long-time flight simmer. And you might be surprised that both are going to come to the same conclusion, but for totally different reasons. So let's go ahead and get started with my perspective as an airline pilot. But first a bit of a background here, where all of that comes from. When I started flying, my first aircraft type after flight school was the Boeing 737NG as well as the 737 MAX, and later I transitioned onto the Airbus A330. The 737 was a beautiful aircraft to build my skills as a pilot on, and the A330 is a great evolution on that. However, those two could easily have been exchanged, and I am completely convinced that I could have built the very same great experience on an Airbus A320 and then later transitioned onto a 747 or a 777 or whatever, and it would have been just as great an evolution. So that kinda doesn't play a role at all over here, and that also excludes that argument that one would be a pilot's aircraft while the other is a flying computer, which you could very well also say about a 787 or a 777 as well, by the way. So that argument doesn't count. Instead, what does count is how is it to work on those aircraft. Flight simmers and aviation enthusiasts alike are often arguing about things like one is a real pilot's airplane while the other is a flying computer. Things like doing this is a lot better than moving a joystick next to you. Now, all of that is nonsense. It doesn't really make too much of a difference whether avionics are looking like A or B. It doesn't make too much of a difference whether airplane manufacturer A gives you more possibility to fuck up the flight controls than airplane manufacturer B. Both have their pros and their cons. Both have shown that accidents that happen to each individual type of philosophy would have been prevented by the other. Think, for example, the Turkish Airlines crash, which would have been prevented by Airbus avionics, just like there have been Airbus accidents that have been caused by automation overload to the pilots that would probably not have happened on a Boeing aircraft. So all of that can kinda be taken out of the equation if you ask me, because it makes no difference whether you are tuning a course and an ILS frequency manually or whether you are checking that the computer has tuned it correctly. As a pilot, you're doing the same thing. At the end of the day, you ensure that the correct course and the ILS frequency are in there. Now, it neither makes a difference whether one computer is covering more aspects than the other, because at the end of the day, if the FMC is inoperative on a 737, you ain't flying nowhere. If the FMS is inoperative on an Airbus, again, you ain't gonna go nowhere. So that's kinda all out of the equation for me. The things that really matter, and this is where real world and flight simulation are deviating from one another, the things that really matter is how is the airplane as an office. Now, with that you can already clearly see that I'm leaning towards Airbus, because the Boeing 737, quite frankly said, has a very small cockpit. And it's not just the 737, the 747 does as well. The 777 and the 787 are better there, but in order to get into that 737, you gotta have your whole acrobatic style in order to somehow make it through that little gap over here, even if the seat is moved all the way to the side, which you often can't even do because your flight bag is too big, because you are carrying your noise-cancelling headset that you absolutely need because it is a very loud airplane, and so on. So that's the very easy answer. Boeing cockpits are rather cramped. You always have that thing in between your legs over here. If you want to eat something, you better hope that you will not need to do this, because otherwise you are going to either block your controls or spill everything that you had on your chest, aka your food, over the entire airplane. That's why Airbus, in my opinion, builds the better aircraft. Now, Boeing actually considered transitioning from a control column to a side stick with the 777 as well, because it is complete fly-by-wire, just like those Airbus aircraft are. At the end of the day, they didn't, because too many people in the aviation industry were like, no, we gotta keep our yokes, those are great things, and only those can control aircraft properly. Yeah, tell those Air Force pilots, are they not flying proper aircraft out there? Alright. So that is what really makes one better than the other from my perspective. Just look around how much space there is, how you can freely move around in your seat, how you have this absolutely wonderful thing in front of you that allows you to eat in your aircraft and to do your paperwork on without having to constantly take the technical logbook out and put it on your chest as a replacement for this absolutely wonderful thing called a table. That is what makes an actual airplane. Now, one argument that I read quite a bit on the internet is that, well, a 737 is a short-haul aircraft, so you surely wouldn't need all that space, would you? Well, that's quite wrong. Even though it is true that the average length of a flight in the 737 is obviously a rather short one when compared with an Airbus A330, then we must not forget that you are not going to do just that single flight on your working day. Much rather, you will probably be doing 4 flights, and at the end of the day, your flight duty period would have been as long as it would be for a long-haul pilot who's just going to do a single one flight on that day. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about flight simulation now that we made it very clear why I prefer the real-world Airbus over the real-world Boeing. Now, flight simulation is obviously rather different because you're always sitting in the same chair, you are always sitting at the same desk, and most of us will always be using the same hardware. And even if you have some different hardware for the different aircraft, well, you can still just roll back a couple centimeters from your desk even if you got that yoke in front of you. So that is surely not going to make any difference in my argument over here. What does make a difference though is the commonality of aircraft. Both have excellent add-ons available, be it the Phoenix for the Airbus or be it the PMDG for the Boeing. So the availability of add-ons doesn't play a role for me. What does play a role is effectively not even how you can learn aircraft, etc., even though we will be talking about that quite a bit in the next couple of minutes. But the actual reason why I prefer Airbus in flight simulation is a whole different one that we'll get to in a few moments. So let's start with flight simming and learning different aircraft types. Now, the number one question that I would always ask if somebody asks me, should I get an A320 or should I get a 737 for my flight simulator, is not, well, what do you prefer, what are your favorite avionics? No, the primary question that I always ask is, what do the operators that you want to simulate actually operate? If you're from the US, then your chances of taking a Boeing are probably higher than if you are from Europe. If you're from Asia, it may be a whole different thing. So that's the kind of question that I'm always suggesting when people are asking me whether they should go for an Airbus or a Boeing in the simulator. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and let's make the mistake. Let's talk about avionics and philosophies, because obviously that does seem to play quite the big role for you guys out there. Now, Boeing and Airbus both have their, let's say, advantages. Now, first of all, neither avionic prevents you from crashing the airplane. Just think about Airbus is flying in the mountains and Boeing into skyscrapers. That works both way around. But what does make a difference is how easy it is to learn one aircraft or the other. And I actually got to give Boeing some credits over here. I think that learning the 737 FMC is quite a bit easier than learning the Airbus A320 FMS. Airbus has, well, let's just say that weird little philosophy that you are inserting the basics just like you do in a Boeing, but then you have those lateral revisions where you can access some stuff, you got the vertical revisions where you access some stuff, then you constantly have to click yourself from one button to the other in order to find different menus. So navigating an Airbus FMS is, in my opinion, a little bit more difficult than the Boeing FMC, which kind of leads you through it with that lovely flow during the pre-flight, where you just press the button on the low lower right to get to the next screen. Now that doesn't cover all the aspects of what you have to do in a pre-flight procedure. Think about checking your flight plan, for example. It will never direct you to the legs page to check all your SIDs and stars and that kind of stuff, but Boeing makes it easier. Then there is the autopilot, where Airbus is getting the credits. Airbus autopilots are a little bit easier than Boeing autopilots if you are a new learner. You basically have everything managed unless you want to do something, then you are pulling the buttons out and then you're doing it yourself. Now, Boeing, well, you gotta press the LNAV and VNAV buttons, then you got all the different kind of criteria and that kind of stuff. So I do believe that the Airbus autopilot is a little bit more intuitive than the Boeing autopilots. Now, in terms of systems and automation, which is what many people cite as the primary difference between the two manufacturers, I don't actually think that there are too many differences. In Airbus, just like in Boeing, you have the dark cockpit philosophy. If there are no lights on, then you don't have to bother. But is that really true? How about the light on the flight recorder ground control button that you have to illuminate during the pre-flight in your lovely Airbus? How about the window heat lights in the Boeing 737? You see, both manufacturers don't have a 100% dark cockpit philosophy, and while it is true that you have to press less buttons in Airbus aircraft because the systems are a little bit more automated, any pilot should still understand what their systems are doing and what their automation is doing at any time. So, in other words, if you want to learn a Boeing as a beginner, you have to memorize pushing a couple more buttons, but really not that many more buttons, especially not if you're thinking about modern Boeings like the 777, 787 and the likes. But any Airbus simmer should basically have an idea and understanding of their systems as well, otherwise we are going to see many fuck-ups and situations where you ask yourself, what is it doing now? Where, well, you should really know anyway. So that's kind of the argument about which aircraft is more, let's say, flight simmer friendly. Now, one thing where Airbus definitely does take the credits for flight simmer friendliness are the protections built into the flight control systems. Now, both aircraft are eventually no longer going to do what you command them to do. The only difference is that Airbus is going to react a little bit earlier, aka while the plane is still controllable, the computers are going to bring it back into a controlled state of flight, while the Boeing is eventually not going to do what you commanded either, but that's when it's aerodynamically out of control already. So, yeah, Airbus does make a little bit easier there to avoid larger mess-ups, especially when you're a beginner, because it supports you a little bit more on the flight control computers. So that point definitely goes out to Airbus. But let's talk about the real reason why I favor Airbus for flight simming over Boeing, and that has nothing to do with the actual aircraft or the philosophies or anything behind them. In fact, it has a very, very easy reason. Commonality. Number one, it is easier for a flight simmer who has learned how to fly an A320 to also fly something like an A330 or even an A350. That's one argument. But the large one is hardware. If I'm getting myself a proper flight simulation hardware, I want to spend $1,000 to get myself a good set of controls. Heck, if I buy an Airbus side stick, then I can fly anything from an A318 to an A380. If I'm getting myself a 737 yoke, congratulations, I have a 737 yoke. But if I ever decide that I want to fly 757, 67, 777, 87, 47, you name it, well, that yoke is probably not going to be all that realistic anymore. And that is my main reason why I would say that in flight simming, Airbus is probably the better choice, especially if you're thinking about getting thrust levers, getting side sticks, pedals, or panels, maybe an FMS, all that kind of stuff. Within the Airbus world, you get one and you have most. In the Boeing world, you get one and you have one. And that's about as easy as it is. You can see, in my perspective on these things... Oh, hello there. In my perspective on these things, philosophies And all the common arguments that we read online don't play all that much of a role. It doesn't make a difference to me whether I'm flying an Airbus or whether I'm flying a Boeing. It doesn't make a difference whether I'm operating an FMS that looks one way or the other. Both of them have advantages in their very own way. What does make the difference is practical aspects. In the Airbus you have more space, you have a table. In the Airbus you have common controls that make it cheaper for you to get flight simulation hardware. Those are the types of arguments that make the debate whether Airbus or Boeing is better, in my opinion. Because at the end of the day, let's face it, we're talking about the two most successful airplane manufacturers. Both of them are producing absolutely excellent aircraft. I would fly an Airbus or a Boeing any day over any of those other manufacturers. So, do we really need to discuss like which avionic philosophy is better, especially taking into consideration that like 99% of aviation enthusiasts have neither understood fully? Have neither understood both fully. You can see which road I'm going down on this. So, thank you very much for watching. That's my opinion on the Airbus versus Boeing debate. Those are my arguments. At the end of the day, both are absolutely excellent aircraft. And if you're now asking me whether I would, change my airline in order to fly aircraft type XYZ, you can already make out the answer to that. Usually absolutely no, because what counts is your lifestyle. Are you living at home? Are you living with your family and friends? Are you doing the type of operation that you want to do? For example, would you prefer flying cargo to places in the Middle East or the United States? Or do you prefer flying holidaymakers to the Caribbean? That's your choice of life. That is what should determine which aircraft type you are flying, and none of the questions whether you are now flying a TriStar or an A350. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed this one. I do hope that you liked my arguments. Now it's up to you to share yours in the comments underneath the video. Like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and now I'm really looking forward to the discussion in the comments below.